One of the questions that I asked you was about power browsing versus deep reading. And if you agree with Carr's assertion or what he seems to suggest, which is that deep reading is really important. If you look at this quotation right here, this takes you to the place in the essay where he discusses it. It's clear that users are not reading online in the traditional sense. Indeed, there are signs that new forms of reading are emerging as users power browse horizontally through titles, contents, pages, and abstracts, going for quick wins. It almost seems that they go online to avoid reading in the traditional sense. So a little bit of context so this quotation makes sense. In the previous paragraph, he mentioned some anecdotes, but then he mentions a study about people's research habits and whether or not they go back to the page that they left and how they actually go from one website to the next and kind of bounce around rather than reading deeply. So you can go back and kind of get a sense of the context here. This quotation is about power browsing versus deep reading. So power browsing, a lot of students will say, hey, power browsing is actually a really important skill. When I'm writing a research paper, I can't deep read every single article or book on the subject. I have to skim through contents pages and look at abstracts. An abstract is a very short summary at the beginning of an academic article. I can't deep read everything, or I would never actually write the essay. So you need to have some of these skills. Maybe there are other areas where you can see power browsing being really helpful, especially as we have so much, we're bombarded with so much information. Maybe it's important that we know how to filter. Maybe it's important to power browse and then gather the texts or the sources that you actually want to read deeply. Even as you're going through a text in this class, I will often encourage you to, yes, read the entire thing, but zoom in and focus in on a couple of key passages and focus on those in depth rather than glossing over the entire passage in kind of a superficial way. So maybe there's a time and a place for power browsing, or maybe we do way too much power browsing and we've forgotten all about that deep reading that requires that we sit with the text for a little while, that we really unpack the words, that we connect it to our own lives. This deep reading that Carr seems to suggest is very valuable. So I'd like to know if you think there are benefits to the power browse, if you think schools should teach students how to power browse. There are all sorts of strategies that are becoming more popular nowadays when we're teaching students how to determine what articles to use in essays and what articles are credible. We often encourage students to do something called lateral reading, which is where they leave the website or they leave the text that they're reading and verify it elsewhere or see if other people have written on it before they go any farther. So these are things to think about as you answer the question. And what does deep reading really mean? Then a little bit farther down, he brings up Woolf and what Woolf says about reading versus speech and how they're different. And according to Woolf, reading isn't etched into our genes the way speech is. So whereas speech comes very naturally for humans, babies start babbling, reading not so much. We have to be taught how to read, or at least that's how the argument goes. I think this quote is a really powerful one. Experiments demonstrate that readers of ideograms, such as the Chinese, develop a mental circuitry for reading that is very different from the circuitry found in those of us whose written language employs an alphabet. So an ideogram is a picture that represents an idea rather than a word that's composed of different letters that make up sounds. The variations extend across many regions of the brain, including those that govern essential cognitive functions as memory and the interpretation of visual and auditory stimuli. We can expect as well that the circuits woven by our use of the net will be different from those woven by our reading of books and other printed works. So this is where he loses some people. Do you agree with the logic here? Do you agree with the assumption that we can expect that the circuits in our brains will be different if we read via the internet versus if we read printed texts? I think the argument, whether or not you agree with it, is a really compelling one. You might even think about language today and how there are so many ways that we communicate, even in English, which uses an alphabet. There are a lot of ways that we communicate through images, emojis. Not exactly the same as an ideogram, obviously, but I think there are examples that you might want to add into this section when you answer this question. We did a texting activity. You might remember the activity from last week where I asked you to write a text message to a friend and then a written message to the same friend. And we talked about if the messages were exactly the same or if they were a little bit different in terms of tone or punctuation or subtext even. So you might think about the connection to the activity that we did last class or last week when you look at these examples of Nietzsche. Basically, right here, what Carr is saying is that Nietzsche's writing changed when he started using a typewriter. You've probably heard of Nietzsche before, the very famous philosopher, but the example here is really about his writing, that the typewriter changed his writing. His writing, which was already terse and to the point, became even tighter, even shorter. So right here, right in front of you is a quotation that I think is really relevant. And it also reminds me of the Garrison Keillor essay that we read earlier in the semester, where he talks about how a really great pen or a big blank sheet of paper, whatever it is, can actually affect not just how much you write, but your writing style and what you end up actually saying in your letter. Perhaps you will, through this instrument, that's the typewriter, even take to a new idiom, the friend wrote in a letter, noting that in his own work, his thoughts and music and language often depend on the quality of pen and paper. So that's the part where Nietzsche's friend is referencing how his writing has changed. That reminded me a little bit of the Garrison Keillor piece. And then a little bit farther down, oh, I think I lost it here. Maybe it's before a little bit here. We have another quote. I didn't highlight it here, but I think it's really important. Nietzsche agrees and says, "You're right. Our writing equipment takes part in the forming of our thoughts. Under the sway of the machine," writes the German media scholar Friedrich A. Kittler, "Nietzsche's prose, or his writing that's not poetry, changed from arguments to aphorisms, from thoughts to puns, from rhetoric to telegram style." I want to break down a couple of words there because these words are actually very important to English classes, especially if you end up taking English 103 after this. So an aphorism is a very short statement that usually has some sort of universal truth to it. Oscar Wilde is famous for his aphorisms. You can think of an aphorism as a short saying that has some sort of kernel of truth, right? Like an apple a day keeps the doctor away. It's a bit cliche, but that's an example of an aphorism. Or brevity is the soul of wit. That's another famous aphorism. So his arguments turned into aphorisms, something much shorter. His thoughts turned into puns. Rhetoric, which is just persuasion, turned into telegram style. So the argument here is that his writing changed as a result of the tool that he was using, which is the typewriter. Now, obviously, Carr is talking about the internet, so think about why Carr is bringing up Nietzsche and what the typewriter did to his writing, and also connect it to your own experiences with the tool that you are using to write and to read. Whether it's Google Docs or texting, whatever it is, do you notice that the tool that you use actually changes your writing? Let's look at one more section here before we end this video. This is the section about how the internet has subsumed other technologies. So I want to read this quote at the top of the page that you see here. "As we use what sociologist Daniel Bell has called our intellectual technologies, the tools that extend our mental rather than our physical capacities, we inevitably begin to take on the qualities of those technologies." So the argument here is when we use some sort of new technology, an intellectual technology or an intellectual tool rather than a physical one, we kind of become like that technology. And here we have a discussion of the clock that I think is really fascinating, and the invention of the clock and what the clock might have done to our conception of ourselves. The clock's methodical ticking helped bring into being the scientific mind and the scientific man, but it also took something away. And if we go a little bit farther down, the conception of the world that emerged from the widespread use of timekeeping instruments, quote, "remains an impoverished version of the older one, for it rests on a rejection of those direct experiences that form the basis for and indeed constituted the old reality. In deciding when to eat, to work, to sleep, to rise, we stopped listening to our senses and started obeying the clock." So the clock brought about scientific thinking. This argument is obviously quite debatable, made people more methodical, made people have a different conception of time. You can see how a clock and its methodical ticking and its quantitative nature kind of makes sense when we're thinking about scientific inquiry and the Enlightenment and experiments, right? You need to have some sort of timekeeping device. But the argument here is that it also took something away, that it disconnected us from maybe the part that made us a little bit human. And if we think about it, how many of us will eat lunch at 12:30 because that's lunchtime? That's the time the clock tells us to eat lunch, rather than when we're really hungry. Or how many of us will wake up at a certain time because we have to get to work at 9, which is sort of the standard time that we've decided the workday begins. So I think there's examples of this. Even though you might not buy this entire argument, I'm not sure that I buy the whole argument, we can think of a lot of examples that we could use to at least consider the argument and how it's relevant to our own lives. The process of adapting to new intellectual technologies is reflected in the changing metaphors we use to explain ourselves to ourselves. When the mechanical clock arrived, people began thinking of their brains as operating like clockwork. Today, in the age of software, we have come to think of them as operating like computers. So again, he's not talking about the clock here, right? He's not talking about typewriters. He's not talking about those inventions. He's talking about much more recent invention, which is the internet. Do you think that we actually think of ourselves, that we actually conceptualize of ourselves as functioning like Google or like computers or even like AI? Do we start to think of ourselves in these terms? Do we use these metaphors to describe ourselves and how we work? I've heard people, when they're discussing someone who knows a lot or who is really smart, I've heard them refer to that person as a human Google or something like that, the same way that we might refer to a person as a human calculator. So do you see some truth in this? And then we get down to, I think, why this is relevant here. The internet, an immeasurably powerful computing system, is subsuming most of our other technologies. It's becoming our map, our clock, our printing press, our typewriter, our calculator, and our telephone, and our radio and TV. And I think it's so true if you think about it. All of those different other technologies really have become absorbed into our phones or into the internet.